My name is Joe Testa. I am one of the organizers of BSides. I function officially as the treasurer. I'm also the co-founder of Positron Security, a local computer consulting firm. And today I am going to talk about problems with elliptic curve cryptography in TLS and SSH. So first, an overview. ECC, elliptic curve cryptography, it's become pretty popular in the last decade. It's used quite a bit in TLS and somewhat in SSH. Common parameters in it are, let's say, shady. And some people think that they've been backdoored by the NSA. So I'm going to go into that. I'm going to go into the history of how, what's happened, the timeline of the progression of how things are standardized. The punchline, though, is that last question: what can you do about it from a sysadmin's perspective? So the punchline is, what can I do? Let's say I have production systems. What can I do to turn these bad parameters off? I don't care if you can go into Apache and write your own custom patch and deploy that. That's not very practical on the big picture in terms of if you have many production systems. So the first question I should answer is, well, what is elliptic curve cryptography? And I promise you this is not a math presentation. I'm not going to go into much math. That's one equation. That's it. Okay, don't panic, anybody. So what ECC is cryptography done with elliptic curves. It's done over finite fields in this form. So it's y squared equals x cubed plus ax plus b, and it's usually mod some prime p. So really what it is it's based on the discrete log problem, which is a very well-tested cryptographic primitive. Just happens to be over elliptic curves. It's a similar primitive that Diffie-Hellman and DSA depend on, and there's EC equivalents of those two, named ECDH and ECDSA. So your next question is probably going to be, why does ECC matter? Well, this chart really drives the point home. If you look on the left side, you've got security strength, say 128-bit security strength. In the traditional crypto world, for DSA and RSA, you would need a key size of 3072 bits in order to achieve that security level. In the ECC world, it's somewhere around 256. There's a range here, 256 to 383. So it's much smaller. Look at the bottom there, that last row. 256 bits of effective strength. In the traditional crypto world, you need a 15,000-bit key. How many people have actually run into a 15,000-bit key out in the real world?
Besides snake oil, right?
Yeah. Nobody. It doesn't exist. Nobody uses it. It's not practical. But take a look at there on the right, bottom right, under ECC, to get that level is somewhere around 512 bits. That's the punchline. As your security strength is increasing linearly, your ECC keys increase linearly. Whereas traditional cryptos, it's increasing exponentially. So that's the problem or that's the main advantage. So, unsurprisingly, key generation is much faster. Embedded devices can encrypt and decrypt faster. They'll use up less power. If you've got an underpowered VM somewhere, it can do more, just with less resources, if you're using ECC. And of course, a 256-bit security level then becomes practical. It wasn't practical before with traditional crypto. However, in the ECC world, it's not just immediately, you can't just immediately use it. You have to set the curve parameters. Going back to that equation that I showed before, the question is, all right, well, what do you use for values, A, B, and P? There's more to it than that. You need a prime order R, a coefficient, and a base point. So this is all like math stuff, and if you were a developer, and you're like, okay, I'm going to use ECC. Oh wait, I got to figure out these things like, okay, am I going to set A to 10, 1,000? Like, what's even valid? Never mind what's good, what's even valid. So, NIST, the National Institute of Standards and Technology, U.S. government agency, they came out in a document, FIPS 186-2, in January 2000. Basically, it was like, hey everybody, here's curve parameters, just use these, don't ask any questions. You know, here they are. And in that document, they defined 3 classes of curves. There was 5 over prime fields, which they say generated randomly. There were 5 over binary fields, which they also said they were randomly generated. And then some special case Koblitz curves. And right off the bat, people thought those random parameters were really suspicious. The way they claimed that they were generated is that they took these random seed values and they ran it through SHA-1. Got a question already?
Yeah, I'm not familiar with that term 5 over. What does that mean? 5
over binary fields, so it's 5 curves defined over binary fields.
Okay.
So they took these, they supposedly randomly generated seed values, they applied the SHA-1 hash algorithm to it, and then they somehow mapped that output to curve parameters. But there's no mention as to where did these seed values come from? For their curve P256, I got right there the seed value. Like, what is that? It looks random, but is this chosen? Did they search through many seed values to produce outputs that make weak curves? So that's really the punchline behind it all, is that where did these come from? A few years ago there was a project called the BAD A55 project, where they took a GPU farm and they did exactly that. They're like, okay, well, we're just going to search through a whole bunch of seed parameters as quickly as we can, apply SHA-1, and evaluate all the outputs and find curves that have bad properties. We're actually going to do this. And so it's a website that you can go to. You can actually download the source code to that stuff. So if you want to generate curves yourself with bad properties, that code's already exists. It's already out there. So back to the NIST document, here's a quote from it. The pseudo-random curves are generated via SHA-1 based on the method given in the ANSI X962 and IEEE standards. Okay, so let's take a look at them. Well, it turns out neither of them are free. The ANSI doc costs $100. The IEEE document currently is $97, although it's $77 for members. I remember 10 years ago I was a grad student here, and I wanted to read that ANSI doc. It was over $500 to get the PDF. So it might as well have not existed. So while doing research on this, recently I started thinking, I wanted to see proof that somebody actually took the seeds, applied SHA-1, and then somehow mapped that to curve parameters. It's not obvious how that's done. You can do that in many, many ways. And it's supposedly defined in the ANSI doc, which I don't have, but I said, okay, well, I'll look around to see, did anybody verify this? I've not found anybody who's verified it. I could be wrong, somebody may have done it, and if you find that, please let me know, because I am very interested. But I personally have not found any proof that the seeds even yield parameters. So these five curves, the ones that defined over prime fields, they started to become very, very popular. P192, P224, P256, and so on. P256, that's a curve that has a security level of 128 bits, and that ended up becoming the most popular. In 2005, the NSA released their, what they call the Suite B protocols. So it's publicly known algorithms that they say, okay, you can use these to protect classified information. So I guess the question is, all right, if there's something called Suite B, what's Suite A? It's actually just fully classified protocols. So in this Suite B, they recommend, okay, you can use ECDSA, ECDH, here's some appropriate parameters, and of course, curve P256 was included. So the US government back then was actively saying, we are going to use the NIST Curves. And I'm going to go into this later, I'm going to talk about this, because one of the big arguments against the idea that these are backdoored is, hey, if they're backdoored, why is the government themselves using them for classified information? So, you know, that does sound pretty compelling, I'll be honest. But I will get back to this, because this is a very interesting point, and I will get back to this. In 2006, ECC got formally added to TLS, version 1.0 and 1.1 in that RFC spec. It referenced what was in this SEC2 document that came in 2000. That SEC document included all the NIST curves. So effectively TLS 1 and 1.1 now has the NIST curves as of 2006, May. Then in August 2008, TLS 1.2, that spec came out and said, we'll just import all the things from SEC2. So again, all the NIST P curves made it in there. A little bit of an aside, if you know anything about Bitcoin, you'll know that it's heavily based on ECDSA. The system designers chose, instead of using the P curves, they were suspicious, I guess, because they picked the SecP 256K1. It's one of the Koblitz curves. It's not even defined in the NIST standard at all. They just decided they wanted to stay clear of that entirely. And so if you look into that curve a little bit more, you can see that the parameters are chosen, and it seems pretty decent. And it's got a nice performance benefit at 30%. So now I'm going to go into a little side story. They can help you understand, maybe put things into context. Talking about this dual EC-DRBG backdoor. It's quite a mouthful, so I'm just going to call it the random number backdoor. The punchline is the NSA got caught red-handed backdooring a standard and pushed this on the public. So I'll go into the details. So in ANSI 9X982, it was defined. This was published in September 2007, although there's early drafts kicking around in 2004. The members of the ANSI committee, right off the bat, they were very suspicious. What they noticed was that this random number generator had these two parameters to it. And if there was a known relation between these two parameters, you'd be able to predict all future output. Like you'd need some small sample of the random number generator, and then you can exploit it by knowing the relation between two of these parameters, and boom, just all the output you now have. It's a fatal flaw for any kind of cryptographic random number generator. So right off the bat, the ANSI committee was very suspicious of it. So they came to a trade-off. They said, okay, we'll include this, but we want to give end users the ability to regenerate their own parameters. So then you can then say, all right, I'm generating this myself, so it can't have this potential problem. They didn't know at the time that the NSA had backdoor. They had just noticed that if somebody inserted backdoor, it's a big problem. However, later on, the OpenSSL project, they were chasing down the FIPS 140-2 certification. And to do that, they had to implement this algorithm. And they said, okay, well, we don't like these parameters either, so we're just going to regenerate our own. No, they were told no, they cannot do that. They have to use the existing parameters in the spec. So for a time, I mean, they didn't like this, but they didn't have a choice. They wanted to get this certification. They had to put that in. So this code, this backdoor, made it into OpenSSL. Some time goes on, and after it got into the ANSI document, it gets through NIST in a special publication in June 2006. About a year after that, some Microsoft employees, Schomau and Ferguson, they gave a presentation saying, you know, hey, this is looking pretty shady here. But nothing happened for like the next 4 years, well, more than that, 6 years or so. That was it. They just said, this looks really shady, and it just didn't go anywhere from there. In 2011, it becomes an ISO standard. So you see, it goes from being in an ANSI document to a NIST document, and then it goes into an ISO standard. And the Snowden leaks happen, as everybody knows. And that's when they got caught red-handed. Here's a quote from the New York Times. Classified NSA memos appear to confirm that the fatal weakness discovered by 2 Microsoft cryptographers in 2007 was engineered by the agency. The NSA wrote the standard and aggressively pushed it on the international group, privately calling the effort a challenge in finesse. So they got caught red-handed. But even more, they paid RSA Corporation $10 million to include it in their BSafe crypto toolkit. And not only that, but as the default random number generator. So RSA accepted the NSA's money. So when this blew up, naturally people got much more suspicious about the NIST P curves. Like at this point, people were very, very concerned. In 2014, Bernstein and Lang came out with this SafeCurves project. It's actually a set of web pages where they evaluate 20 curves across 11 criteria. And in that was 3 of those P curves, along with SecP 256K1, that's the Bitcoin. Anybody want to guess what those results were? So, if you were a math person, you could click on any of those column names, and it'll go into like all the math. Like here's all the math that we did on this curve, and here's why this looks bad, and this other thing looks bad too. It's well beyond the scope of my presentation, so I'm not going to go into that. But basically, what it's saying overall is it's nothing immediately exploitable, but it's got these little properties that they're just not looking good. And in the crypto world, there's that feeling that if there's smoke, there's fire. So if you're seeing these red flags, it's just not looking good. Take, for example, SHA-1. SHA-1 has been breaking slowly for like the last decade. A decade ago, it was showing cracks, showing some problems. And then all the way up until maybe a couple weeks ago, I think Google came out with supposedly some method to produce collisions. So SHA-1's been slowly breaking for a decade. At the very least, you can look at this and say, it's not looking good. If you look all the way at the bottom, there's curve 255.19, straight green across the board. Not shown as curved 448, but it also had full passing marks. I'm thinking I don't want to read this whole thing out loud. In August 2015, the NSA released this big bombshell of a statement, and I'll summarize it. Basically what had happened is that for 2 decades, NSA was strongly pushing ECC for US government use. and suddenly they said, you know, thanks for migrating from traditional crypto to ECC. Thank you for going along with that, for putting in all the effort. But at this point, we don't want you to continue doing that anymore. Just wait and save your money and wait for us to come out with post-quantum resistant algorithms. So this was just a big bombshell that got dropped on everybody. First of all, they were the biggest proponents of ECC. And second of all, they don't just make these like huge statements out of nowhere. It was very bizarre. So it kicked off a whole bunch of conspiracy theories. Some people thought, well, if they're moving away from that, does that mean ECC is completely broken? Does it mean that traditional crypto is broken and they don't want people to move to ECC? That's a possibility. Maybe they broke post-quantum algorithms and they want everybody to move to that quickly so that they can break everybody's crypto there. All kinds of conspiracy theories. I'm not going to say much more than just listing them. They're interesting to think about, but past that, there's no proof. At the same time, interestingly, in Suite B, which was that suite of protocols that they want the US government to use, they just silently dropped P256. They didn't say anything about it, it just disappeared overnight. Literally, it just disappeared, and they said nothing about it. They didn't say anything about why, just they replaced it with P384. So two cryptographers, Koblitz and Menezes, they published an informal paper. It's quite in-depth and rather interesting. One of the things they talked about, because this was a topic that had come up, is, all right, so let's talk about these NIST curves maybe being backdoored. And this is an opposing view, and I thought it would be fair to include them. So they showed some estimations. All right, they said, all right, here's some math. They figured out, okay, if the NSA in 1997, if they could iterate, let's say, 2 to the 48 seeds, then that would imply that 2 to the 209 weak curves would exist in a pool of 2 to the 257th. So in other words, there would be this massive pool of weak curves. And here's a quote. This would mean that this huge class of weak curves was known to the NSA in 1997, but is still undiscovered by outside researchers in 2015. It is highly unlikely that such a large family of weak elliptic curves would have escaped detection by the cryptographic research community from 1997 to present. So this is an opposing view, and I include this because I do want to present this topic fairly. But like I said before, I am going to refer to this later. This does tie into what some of my conclusions at the end. So yeah, they went through those crazy, based on the NSA announcement, they went through all those crazy conspiracy theories. Like I said, one of the interesting ones that they floated was they pointed out that, hey, you know, during the Cold War with the USSR, their economy tanked, like they failed as a result. So maybe the NSA threw out that bombshell of a statement because maybe a crypto Cold War could damage them too, and I just included that because it's kind of funny. That's our this year's theme for BSides is crypto Cold War. But another possibility is, well, maybe they just, what they said is exactly what they meant. We just need to move past ECC and traditional crypto to something post-quantum. So in a summary, that rationale that I read off before, it does sound compelling, but I can't get over it. Look at these seed values. It's entirely possible that they chose them, they iterated over them to find weak curves. There's just no rationale ever provided. I just can't get over that. And again, like I pointed out before, there's that project where you can take, there's public code now. You can take a GPU farm and generate your own weak curves and then claim that they were random. And of course the NSA got caught red-handed. So that was you know, it's another thing that really stands out. Here's a quote from the former director, Director Hayden, from the NSA. It's kind of a rambling, it sounds like he was talking, and they just quoted him directly, from the Washington Post. It's a little rambling, but I'll read it out loud. You look at a vulnerability through a different lens, even if even with the vulnerability it requires substantial computational power or substantial other attributes, and you have to make the judgment, who else can do this? If there's a vulnerability here that weakens encryption, but you still need 4 acres of Cray computers in the basement in order to work it, you kind of think no bus. And that's a vulnerability we're not ethically or legally compelled to try to patch. It's one that ethically and legally we could try to exploit in order to keep Americans safe from others. So he's talking about this no bus policy, which stands for nobody but us. So you can kind of interpret this as the missing link. So I said before, one of the big arguments against the NIST Curves being backdoored is the fact that the US government uses them. So they say, well, why would the government push backdoored curves and if they were then using it themselves? Well, because of this no-bus policy. If they think that nobody else can exploit these issues but them, then they could plausibly feel safe pushing them on the public. So in terms of what my personal suspicions are, I do think that the NSA did iterate through seeds and chose parameters that chose the seeds that they created the parameters that looked weak at the time. And I think maybe they chose them and they looked at them and they said, okay, well, we can't exploit them immediately, but they look weak. So maybe we can in the future, like that thing I said before, where there's smoke, there's fire. It's possible that they had found these sets of curves and said, okay, well, we can't take advantage of them right now, but maybe 10 years from now we can. And you know, maybe they did. Maybe 10 years after that, they found a way to break all those cryptography based on those curves. Maybe they did 18 years later, which would have been just 2 years ago. Maybe they never did. Maybe if we keep using them, 3 years from now, they're going to break them then. So these are all plausible things to me. But let's dial it back and just look at the facts. Fact is that SafeCurves Project, they showed that P256 and 384, they do have some bad properties. That's a fact. Another fact is the NSA just dropped P256. So they no longer recommend it for classified data. And there happens to be other curves that are created by the community with better properties, so in the end you have to really ask yourself why continue using them, the P curves. So in terms of alternatives, since I just spent so much time up here talking about these curves that are bad, so the question would be, well, what's better? There's this curve 25519, which was proposed by Bernstein. It's 128 bits of security. Rationale for all the parameters is provided. It's got excellent performance. And it's not just academic, it's actually being used. It's become the default in OpenSSH for like the last 3 years, over 3 years. It's been the default, so it's in use. There's this curved 448, also known as the Goldilocks curve. It's got the same perks, but offers more security, about 224 bits. Both happen to be formalized in an RFC, and they're actually referenced in the upcoming TLS 1.3 spec. So now here's the punchline. So this is why I undertook this big research project, is I wanted to find out how can I get rid of them, how can I disable them from a sysadmin's perspective, something that's practical. And you see all the way at the bottom, I originally put, I got bad news for you guys, and I crossed that out. I ended up stumbling on some more information just yesterday, so I had to update my slides quickly. So I was going to say that in Apache and ModSSL, you just can't, and it's fixed, but it turns out I was wrong. You can, in theory, still use any of the other curves, because if you recall what I said before, the SEC2 curves were incorporated into TLS. So there's more than just the P curves. There's SEC P256K1, which is it's the Bitcoin curve. In theory, you can use that. And after I was wrong, after it turned out that I was wrong about Apache ModSSL, I did say Nginx, you can't change it either, although now I'm starting to second guess myself. But it does always appear by default to use P256. If you use the SSL scan tool, SSL scan, if you guys use that, are you familiar? It's a tool to analyze TLS tunnels. If you run that against, let's say, a default Apache or Nginx, you'll see, I've got there in bold how you can actually spot that out. It's curve P256 is in use in that cipher suite. And you'll see that a lot. You'll see that in all the ECDH and ECDSA cipher suites. So this is what I had just found out very recently. In ModSSL, there's this very obscure command, SSL OpenSSL conf CMD, which you can then say, all right, I just want to use this one curve. It seems very, very rarely used. So I started thinking, well, even if it does work, if only like 0.0001% or whatever of all servers are using it in production, are you sure you want to roll the dice on that? I mean, it doesn't seem like something that's used very much at all. So if you turn that on your production server, what's going to happen? And strangely, when I then scan with SSL scan, after I specified that curve, it still tells me the P256 is in use. So either this is a bug in SSL scan or it's a bug in ModSSL, I don't know. So I don't know what's going on. So what you could do is you could disable ECDH entirely. The problem, though, is that you'll break Firefox because you should have SHA-1 disabled as well, and if you turn off SHA-1 and ECDH, Firefox just has no cipher suites left to communicate, and it gives you that error. It just says no cipher overlap. So you can't turn off, as of right now, I tested this against Firefox 53, which is pretty new. You cannot turn off ECDH and SHA-1 and support Firefox. Now you can use ECDSA and X509 certificates. You've got quite a bit of curves to choose from when you generate them. But a lot of them didn't pass that SafeCurves test. And a lot of them even offer less security than 128 bits, so there doesn't seem to be good choices there. So for now, in terms of X509s, you probably want to just stick with traditional RSA, so 3072 or 4096 bit keys. So there's some good and bad news about TLS 1.3. It's currently in a draft state. The good news is that curve 25519 and 448, they're both included in the spec. But guess what? So are the NIST curves. And here's a quote from the spec. A TLS compliant application must support key exchange with SecP256R1, which happens to be P256, just a different name, and should support key exchange with X25519. So it doesn't mean that everybody's going to be forced to use it. It means that compliant applications need to support that. So your server, if you want to be fully compliant, has to accept those connections from clients. So it sounds like you're going to be able to disable them if you want and use these better curves, but I get the feeling it's not going to be there by default. So you know right off the bat, like 90% of people are just going to be using the default. Much better news for SSH. These curves were a part of SSH for quite a long time. Like I said before, the default got changed about 3 years ago. You can use this key exchange algorithms directive. It's very easy to just disable them. And you can just straight up disable ECDSA as well. So it's very easy. That's the good news, is that in SSH, you can disable them pretty easy. By default, though, a lot of distros just have them sitting there. So there's to extend on that, there's this excellent hardening guide for SSH available. So if you want to know exactly what to do, that right there is an excellent hardening guide. I use that all the time. It also talks about how you disable other things like SHA-1, DSA, and other stuff. You could probably even disable more than what's in that guide because there's a new version of PuTTY that came out, so you could probably tighten things even more. Any questions? Yep.
Any word on LibreSSL, on what they're doing with these vulnerable curves?
So LibreSSL is, for anybody who doesn't know, it's an alternative, it's a fork of OpenSSH. But they're bound to adhere to the spec. TLS 1.0, 1.1, 1.2, they have to abide by the spec, so it's all in there. You got a question?
I was going to say, how would you go about, okay, so like, I work at a bank. I've been told, I never confirmed it, but I've been told that banking algorithms have to comply with NIST standards.
So it's probably that
So
FIPS 140.
yeah, the FIPS 140-2 and was the 186-2. So, because I've, same concerns that you had, and I've like recommended like curve 25, 519 and stuff from, they're like, well, we can't do that because we have regulatory things that we have to meet. How do we address something like that? I mean, other than sort of, trying to get NIST to change their standards.
You're bogged down by just a whole lot of red tape. I mean, that's what the problem is. I mean, you have to comply with your regulations, otherwise you get what, massive fines.
Yeah, massive fines.
Yeah, I mean, that's right there the problem. So you have to change the regulatory compliance standards, which that's a massive uphill battle. Good luck with that. I mean, that's all I can tell you.
Yeah.
I mean, you don't really have a choice.
Damned if you don't.
Yeah. Any other questions?
So one thing I thought was interesting was that your point about TLS 1.3 still including these curves that are certainly questionable. Mm-hmm. Do you think one of the things that might be contributing to the fact that things are still, maybe not encouraged, but at least still supported strongly, is that there's a relatively small community of people contributing to these kind of documents?
I suppose that, yeah, that is a factor. And the conspiracy theorists will say, like, oh my God, they're just filled with NSA moles. The other rationale could be that, well, here's curves that have been used and tested, and we want to be conservative and not really rush into these other things. That's another perspective. What's really going on, I can't really say. Yep.
Let's get conspiracy theory on this for just a second. Do you think that protecting the information that these are compromised cryptography is what's holding back the 17 agencies from disclosing how they know that the Russians interfered in the last election?
Yeah, I'm not really.
I mean, because they didn't do an awful lot to hide their tracks. We followed it into Cozy Bear and Soft Bear and Gummy Bear for a while. So is it, we talked about a Cold War. One part of the reason of Cold War is to make the enemy reduce the value of their assets by making them public. That's part of the strategy.
Well, what I was bringing up before, and this is not my theory. It was just a theory that was floated. I just thought it was pretty amusing, so I thought I'd just talk about it at least. The idea was that in the Cold War, their economy just failed. Like they couldn't handle that strain, whereas ours worked. So the idea is, well, maybe that's what they're trying to do. It's like, let's force them to waste lots of money by saying, hey, everybody needs to move to post-quantum cryptography. And now China and Russia is just going to exert so much effort to try to get to that, and they just waste a lot of money, and it's like, haha, we got you to waste your money, that kind of thing. But in terms of any kind of relation to what's been going on lately, I don't think there's all that much evidence. I'm not seeing any direct evidence.
That's kind of why, is what I'm saying. That they're protecting this surmise.
Well, I'm not really, if there's evidence of it, I would consider
how I
it,
started this conversation? Conspiracy theory.
correct.
Let me comment on that, because I just came from a talk where former NSA whistleblower Walter Finney was giving a keynote. His theory on this is because they basically, the only way that they could do this is they would, because they basically will take equipment and backdoor it, like routers and switches and everything. And so they put things like trace routes and stuff embedded in them. So he says they could have, if it came from Russia, they could actually nail it down to the exact building it came from. He says, but his theory is that they don't want to do that because they would then reveal what their capabilities are.
That's what I'm saying.
Yeah.
Exactly.
I don't think it has to do with the elliptic curve technology so much as it is, but I think it is other things that they don't want revealed.
They don't want to compromise an asset.
Right, exactly.
Any other questions? Thank you very much.
Thank you.